Meni je stvarno, moram stvarno izviniti zato što će predavanje biti na engleskom jeziku, zato što je zamišljeno prvobitno da predavanje ide sa profesorom Imreom Zemanom, koji je taj kanadski istraživački direktor kod kojega sam radila postdoktorsko istraživanje, tako da ja sam bukvalno sletjela prošle sedmice iz Amerike, morala bih ponovo pisati rad da sam ga prevela na srpski, tako da možda Q&A možemo na našem jeziku, a morat ću još jednom da se izvinim što, mislim, predavanje na engleskom, ali tako ispalo, prosto mi je lakše tako, nadam se da se mi svi govorimo istim jezikom i onda je prosto glupo, a mislim da bi zvučalo traljavo da ga sad krenem automatski prevoditi, nisam se spremila za isto, tako da još jednom moje najdublje izvinjenje. Okay, so without further ado, I'll proceed in English, and this paper is it's a sort of a big chunk of work because we've tried, it's 3 people, it's based on a paper published for the Journal for Southeast European and Black Sea Studies, so it's a collaboration of 3 authors, so this is not just my work, it's also a collaboration between another cultural studies scholar and an economist who studied privatization processes, and I think it's really important to sort of paint the picture what was going on in Bosnia for the past or during the past 20 years in order to reach to the point which is where I want to lead you, which is this document called Compact for Growth and Development, which is a very, very significant document that emerged 2 years ago. So I kind of need to give you the context first, and I believe that context is meaning, then context creates meaning, which is I will in my usual manner, will speak in footnotes a lot. So this is just to give you a flavor. I'm pretty sure you know already about Dayton and Brussels. Serbia is also undergoing same or similar processes on its presumed path to Europe, but Bosnia is, I would say, still a little bit different because of Dayton Peace Agreement, because of the Office of High Representative, and all these other sort of agencies, factors, international, both international and domestic, that played a huge role in it. So without further ado, I'll just say a couple words about Dayton. I'm not going to dwell too much about on it. Dayton is a peace agreement. It's a consociation. It's a consociational constitution, which pretty much on November, it was signed in Dayton, Ohio, on November 21st. It divided the country into 2 entities plus District Brčko. Formally speaking, the Republic of Srpska and the Federation of BiH, and it defined, basically established that Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks are constitutive peoples, which means that only if you declare yourself as a Serb, Croat, or Bosniak can you participate in political life in this country. And throughout the Dayton period, Bosnia and Herzegovina has been in a state of perpetual transition on a presumed pathway to join the EU, but subject to an ever-changing message about how and under what terms. This is partly to blame Dayton for, because although it established peace, it also, its complex power-sharing mechanisms between and among different levels. As you know, we have cantons, entities, all these different levels, different jurisdictions of government, produced a disorder that needed to be managed both by local and international elites. So Dayton Agreement, although it brought peace, is also partly responsible for the social and political instabilities in BiH, and in many ways has actually blocked the EU integration of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Various EU-backed initiatives tried to amend or reform Dayton Constitution. I don't know if you've heard of the April package, Butmir package, Prude process, all of which pretty much collapsed. They were promoted in the name of greater administrative efficiency, but each of these initiatives threatened to deprive the negotiating parties of significant instruments of their political power. And of course, these parties weren't just going to willingly relinquish everything that they have accumulated for the past 20 years. Most famously, the European Court of Human Rights judgment on the so-called Sejdić-Finci case, which you probably know, in 2009, which is the case of a Roma and a Jewish politicians who wanted to include the category of others into the Dayton Constitution. That also failed pretty much, and basically the EU representatives, up until 2014, they made it clear that the Sejdić-Finci ruling implementation presented a main precondition for the accession of Bosnia into the EU. And that's how things were up until the protests and plenums. So this sort of disruption to Dayton, okay, so we had this precondition from the European Court of Human Rights, but also in 2012, we had Banja Luka protests, Picin Park, so-called Park is Ours protests, in the spring and summer of 2012, and then later the so-called JMBG, JMBG revolution, which was popularly called Bebolucija in Sarajevo. And both of these events were marked by significant cross-entity relations of cooperation and solidarity among activists in these respective cities. Crossing Dayton, crossing all administrative and political boundaries produced by the Dayton Order. And then indeed when the protests in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, primarily in Tuzla and in Sarajevo, but also some smaller Bosnian cities, started, the whole talk on Dayton was pretty much backgrounded. I remember from talking to some of my activist friends that they told me how the so-called anti-Dayton group, so in Sarajevo there's this group called the Anti-Dayton Group, but basically they're Bosniak nationalists, right? And they have the Lily flag, and they're against Dayton, but for the wrong reasons, I would say. This group was banned to come to plenums and protests because the activists at the time didn't really want any of the nationalist discourse to really jump into the picture, because the protests and plenums of 2014, at least at the very beginning, were about social justice, redistribution, abolition of the so-called white bread payments. In Republika Srpska, where I come from, I remember some of my friends, even my parents were saying, oh, this is just something that's orchestrated from the Federation to kill Republika Srpska, stuff like that. So, the protests and plenums did receive, not only in Republika Srpska, where they didn't happen to begin with, but in the Federation, a lot of negative media coverage, right? So these, this was an event, right, that happened and disrupted, and by the way it was structured and pitched, it was very disruptive to the Dayton Order, because it wanted to do nothing with nationalism, with ethnic nationalism, any of the sort, but with redistribution and literally abolishing all the politicians' benefits that they were getting for the past 20 years. What was the EU response, or what was the response of the international community? Well, in July 2014, the so-called British-German initiative emerged. This is just Bosnia. The so-called British-German initiative emerged when Steinmeier and Hammond, German prime, he's still there. He's still their prime minister, right? Hammond, Frank Hammond, no? He was a foreign minister, Frank Walter Steinmeier, and Philip Hammond was the British one. Sorry, Steinmeier is the German one. They basically issued the so-called British-German initiative, and that signaled a renewed interest in Bosnia, in post-Dayton Bosnia, and that was an attempt to jumpstart the stalled EU accession process, because Bosnia signed the SAA in 2008, but it didn't move anywhere since. Also, one document emerged from this so-called British-German initiative, and this is the Compact for Growth and Development, which is a document containing 6 measures on how to jumpstart Bosnian economics, and it signals sort of the shift from the political to the economic. So basically, I would like to offer some context and perhaps some diagnostic as how to gauge whether the post-Dayton political field has shifted in the aftermath of the process, whether these protests and plenums meant anything at all. And maybe we can then in Q&A compare the situation between Bosnia and Serbia in this way. But before I do that, I'd like to spend some time just to sort of give you a brief sort of intro to these three. I call those, I've identified three stages of the so-called political-economic restructuring of the Dayton political field. Three phases. They were temporal, but they also coincided with the economic shift. My PhD 10 years ago was about Office of the High Representative's discourse. So I spent a lot of time analyzing particularly this organization, which, you know, I don't think it was, neither in Croatia nor in Serbia, nowhere in the Balkans was there such an organization that was kind of created impromptu, ad hoc, to administer, to basically serve as the final authority in theater when it came to Dayton Agreement implementation and peace building and state building in post-Dayton Bosnia and Herzegovina. So this organization is really, I think they're now opening archives. And you know, we'll see more and more people writing about the OHR, Office of the High Representative, OHR, or whatever, because in many, many ways it was unprecedented what they did, how they behaved, how they, especially during the reign of, deliberately say reign of Peri Eshdown, who in one day, it was 30th of June 2004, issued a press release by which he removed 60 politicians from office. I'm not saying these politicians were great, but you know, you can't just remove from office 60 people in one day. Well, he was able to do that, and then his successor, Christian Schwarz-Schilling, then in 2005 issued a number of reverse removal decisions to reinstate those people back into, I mean, it was insane. And I tracked down their press releases from 96 till 2005. So I'm pretty, you know, well acquainted with the sort of the textual and the actual politics of the OHR's discourse. So the first phase in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I identified as a phase that started pretty much with the Dayton Peace Agreement in 1996 and went on until 2006. And this is the stage, this is the so-called democratization and Europeanization phase, which is marked by the heavy OHR presence, NATO, OSCE, many branches of the UN, which pretty much did everything from providing peacekeeping forces. They ran elections, OSCE was in charge of elections, supervised local police. As a young translator back in the time, I was 21, in I was actually 19, my God. I was a translator, I kid you not, at a course for our local police in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was called Human Dignity. I mean, if you don't have to be a linguist and to know presuppositions to know, okay, if you organize a course called Human Dignity, which is a weekly course to train all police forces in the country, that to presume that these guys didn't really have any dignity, you know, our police officers. Well, so, you know, there were things like that. Some really, really interesting things went on in post-Dayton Bosnia, Human Dignity, but also I have to give them credit for providing us with license plates and Bosanska marka, the currency which we still have right now. This was, during this period, OHR exercised a set of powers normally associated with the state. So they basically performed during those first 10 years the role of the state. And this was all carried under the sign of democratization, Europeanization, all these different things. The second phase, which is the phase between 2006 and 2014, is the phase of the rise of power of two most prominent politicians at the time. One is still the most prominent politician in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is the phase of 2006 when Haris Silajdžić and Milorad Dodik won the elections. I mean, Dodik became prime minister even before because Čavić gave him the mandate to do so. And this is the phase which involves privatization of big enterprises such as telecom. This is the rise of the so-called Baja class of like real strongmen in Bosnia and Herzegovina who were no longer international community. They were backed by the international community, of course. But this is the second. This is also the stage of weakening of the international community, and this is the stage marked by sharpening of nationalist exclusionary rhetoric as well. This phase pretty much went on uninterruptedly until 2014, and
sure. Da, do 2006. godine, znači, ta podjela između tih faza se vezuje za izbore.
Ta se podjela vezuje za fazu. Ima jedan članak Matthew Parrisha koji je fantastičan iz 2007. gdje on daje, ja se pozivam tu na taj članak, gdje on kaže ovo što ste kukali OHR kao više ne postoji. Ono što se dešava jeste imate sad vaše. Znači to je situacija gdje Dodik dolazi kao prime minister, kao premijer, jer ga Čavić pušta. I on, prosto Čavić nije imao tu snagu, mislim, ja se sjećam tog perioda, i on njemu jednostavno poziva ga da bude, i onda on Dodik je dobio izbore, koliko je, 80%? To je strašno, on je razbio izbore 2006. Jer šta je Dodik bio? Dodik je bio tada još uvijek čovjek koga je Madeleine Albright nazivala Daškom svježeg povjetarca na Balkanu, američki čovjek, koji pričao jednu potpuno drugu priču tada, pa čak i periodu prije 2006. koju priča sada. Znači, taj isti Čavić je 2004. priznao Srebrenicu, to je bila njegova politička smrt. Znači, tu se Čavić gasi. Čavić sad nešto opet pokušava, ali nema on tu snagu. Znači, Dodik dolazi velikom većinom. Znači, SNSD se pojavljuje kao jedan ogroman igrač na sceni, a to koincidira sa periodom privatizacije velikih preduzeća. Šta on tad privatizuje? Telekom. Tad se kreće Banja Luka grad, znači vi sad ne znam jeste bili skoro, bila Adriana u Banja Luci, tad se pravi ona veličanstvena zgrada vlade, daju se pare u kulturu. Ja se sjećam, Dunja Blažević dolazi, evo, izvinjam se, moram odreagovati, tad se strašne pare slijevaju u kulturu i tad Banja Luka ima tipa 2 filmska festivala, 1 jazz festival, u jednom momentu puno je para, to je još taj period kao nedefinisan malo, i tu vrlo brzo kreće ta Silajđić Dodik, kreće to zaoštravanje retorike. I tu dolazimo do faze gdje je danas, imate slučaj Krganović, ne znam da li ste pratili, dešava se jedna stvarno sječa, vi nemate javnom prostoru, ne možete ništa reći ako to nije in line with the official rhetoric. Mislim, pogledajte naše medije, sve će vam biti jasno. Ali to počinje, to naravno nije bio rez, to je išlo polako, međutim, to je ta druga faza i u toj drugoj fazi tad je Lajčak, visoki predstavnik, on nije imao, mislim, on nije bio ni blizu Ped Ježdana, on prosto nije imao tu moći. Jer šta je, ni međunarodna zajednica u tom periodu, shift se mijenja, fokus se mijenja, nije više te svoje bonske ovlasti koje je dobila 97. koje je Ped Ježdan obilato koristio, to više Lajčak, Christian Schwarz-Schilling, makakav. Mislim, on je vratio sve Ježdanove odluke, jer su oni vidjeli da su pretjerali u tom trenutku. Mislim, jer to je ono bilo demokratizacija, a rezultat je nikakva demokratija, kao, ok, šta radiš? Okay, so let me just go back on the third phase, which is the sort of the post-2014 restructuring that began after plenums and protests. I'm going to illustrate this phase by giving you an example. When Stefan Füle came to Sarajevo in February 2014, the buildings were burning. And he said on that day, I think it was 7th of February, no, I did not come here to discuss protests and plenums. Like Bill Clinton, I did not have sex with this woman, you know. I did not come here to discuss protests and plenums. I've come here to discuss Sejdić-Finci, because Sejdić-Finci remained as this big sort of Achilles heel of the EU accession process. So he came literally to discuss that. The next day, the very next day, they published EU enlargement office, whatever, they published a rapid press release in which, I mean, I've done a textual analysis of that document as well, in which you could see how the whole talk on Sejdić-Finci becomes backgrounded. They literally gave up on Sejdić-Finci and said, look, here's this compact, we have to do something about Bosnia's economics, because this can not go on, we want to help people, blah, blah, blah. We'll see what happened with that, because this is a new... So in this new stage, Sejdić-Finci is off the table. The Compact for Growth and Development that emerged as the so-called reform agenda, that's the main talk, that's the talk of the day, and this is the precondition for the MMF money, IMF money, this is a precondition for everything, so it's this economic shift. Basically what's happening here with Vučić, they basically want the same sort of situation to happen in Bosnia. There are a few things to note about this economic restructuring that occurred during the first two phases. The first is that it was part of a larger ideological shift away from the values of Yugoslav socialism, including the principle of self-management of workers, Socially owned property as a kind of commons, anti-fascism and brotherhood and unity. Ethno-nationalist parties were hostile to these values because they undermined their claims to legitimacy as ethnic representatives, and they were an obstruction to their ability to enrich themselves through privatization and extend control through relations of patronage and the ability to distribute jobs, because this is what the nationalists did. International forces were also hostile to these values because they were associated with socialism, against which Western countries defined their systems of political freedom, democracy, and prosperity, market-based economy based upon the value of private property. This resulted in a regime of selective remembering and forgetting of the past and the attempt to delegitimize the material and ideological basis of non-ethnic social and political membership, as well as collective action, particularly those of workers. More specifically, the reality of socially owned property ended during the war when this is the first law on privatization, when the socially owned property became of self-managed companies and firms was declared to be state-owned property, paving the way for the privatization process that would come in the post-Dayton period. This move undercut the ability of workers to independently organize for their rights when nationalist political parties pursued their goals through aggressive identity politics. Svi se sjećamo, ušli su u fabrike kao radnici, a izašli kao Srbi, Hrvati i muslimani. Right. So let me spend some time talking about privatization, because I believe that it is also an important piece of this puzzle to see how privatization went on. Basically, internationally, I mean, we can all say in Kafana, you know, that basically the war in Yugoslavia started to, you know, not because of nationalism, but because of the economics. And we kind of tend to, I mean, for the past 15 years, I think, the international discourse on the war in Yugoslavia was pretty much focusing, I don't know the German situation, but I know the Anglo-American one. It had to do a lot with identity politics. And I think that we are now witnessing a period when this is really moving, that we're now finally moving from identity politics. We're starting to look into the economics. Andrea Živković wrote about it. A couple of people, I'm sure in Serbia, there are people who are studying that as well. So we're finally moving away from these ancient hatreds, you know, nationalists, oh, you know, it's all bad, stuff like that. We're now focusing on the economics. And our work is also an attempt to contribute to this gap. You know, there is an amazing book by Darko Suvin. I don't know if you had a chance to read Samo jednom se ljubi, on bureaucracy as a class in Yugoslavia. It's really great. So although the privatization of these formerly socially and state-owned enterprises was made possible in B&H in the immediate pre-war period, I mean, this is when the first laws were passed as the war was raging. Imagine only these new states, right? They were just different states. There was no longer Yugoslavia, and that was the onset of the privatization, the so-called Marković privatization. But the privatization in Bosnia really only took off the first, or this would be like the second stage, during the so-called, under the guidance of USAID, yeah? This was in the phase of strong international interventionism. And between 2006 and 2008, and this is particularly you know, related to privatization of big strategic companies, which is also the phase of consolidation of nationalist party control. This is what was happening back then. The first wave of Marković privatization enabled workers of socially owned enterprises to buy shares at a discount relative to the enterprise's estimated values based on the previous year's annual balance sheets, but these shares could not be traded in on the stock market, in the secondary markets. However, this privatization, as you know, was interrupted by the war, and previously purchased shares were only partially recognized as worker-owned in the subsequent privatization episodes. Even I was entitled to some vouchers. I mean, and then we were told, like, you know, you need to put those vouchers somewhere in some company. I remember Vojvođanska banka was the buzzword of the time, and I don't know. So the war in B&H was not just about political, it was also about economic reorganization. During the war, what had been defined as socially owned was declared by various laws and bylaws as state-owned property or private capital, which was a practice of dispossession through which the political elites and warlords robbed Bosnian citizens of what had previously been understood as common ownership. Legal validation of this dispossession came through the USAID-guided privatization in 1997, as the privatizations of what were now state-owned enterprises, which meant, because Bosnia was divided by Dayton. What was state-owned? Well, it was divided to Republika Srpska-owned and Federation-owned, continued through the already mentioned voucher model. This policy enabled citizens, as I said, to buy shares in state companies which were to be privatized, and in this way the voucher-based privatization contributed to the consolidation of economic power in the hands of the few by enabling those who had means, connections, and resources to engage in active secondary trading of vouchers. Of course, common people, ordinary people couldn't do it, right? I remember, sjećam se, ljudi su kupovali staru deviznu štednju, mislim, to je i ovdje verovatno bilo, po bagatelno, i onda su oni s tom starom deviznom štednjom otkupljivali firme. Znači, to su Slovenci neki dolazili. To je jedan divlji period bio, to je period taj 98. 9. 2000. taj neki period. Right, so basically the third and ongoing wave of privatization further included the issuing of public tenders and bids, mainly intended for those enterprises deemed to be of strategic value, telecommunications, electrical companies, refineries, and already the problem with these processes were signaled by the creation of laws meant to review privatizations that had already concluded but were deemed to have failed. The benefits of these privatization processes remain dubious in Bosnia and Herzegovina. First, switching public enterprises from a socially owned to a state-owned structure opened a window of opportunity for those processes to be misused by the ruling oligarchies and political parties. Additionally, the chosen privatization models, direct tender and voucher, enabled the devastation of former industrial giants as well as small enterprises that had contributed to the development of B&H economy after World War II. Finally, from a workers' perspective, privatization meant two things. First, stripping workers of management and control over their enterprises, and additionally depriving them of the material basis of their existence through massive layoffs, often without compensation. So this is what happened pretty much in Bosnia. And it was into this situation and against this status quo that the protests of February 2014 intervened. The protesters emerged as indignant subjects who, like the Spanish indignados, who also felt they were not represented by any existing political parties, insisted on forms of direct action and direct democracy, partly through violence and partly through their ability to self-organize and independently analyze the political and social hurdles the country was facing. With slogans such as "We are hungry" in 3 languages, so there's just some photos. This is Banja Luka in solidarity with the protesters from Tuzla. This is Tuzla. This is the cantonal government building burning. And this is Sarajevo. So just to sort of have some ideas. So with slogans "We're hungry" in 3 languages, the citizens demanded a general turn towards using the machinery of government to fulfill the aims of greater social justice. At the height of the plenum activities, the May 2014 floods revealed the corruption and inaptitude of the government and channeled the newly found sense of possibility achieved through self-organization into unprecedented grassroots humanitarian work that crossed all ethno-territorial boundaries. So how did the international community react to this, to the moment of protest and political experimentation? They were complaining for 20 years that Bosnian public was lethargic, passive, etc., etc. So when the Bosnian public finally emerged as these indignant subjects burning the buildings, the response came that very summer in the form of the compact backed by the already mentioned British-German initiative. This clearly signaled a shift from the political to the economic. The compact sidestepped the question of constitutional reforms. Sejdić-Finci was part of the constitutional reforms, to instead focus on economic reforms, seeking to modernize and reignite Bosnian economy, spur investment, and create jobs. It also resequenced the EU conditionality program for B&H by removing the Sejdić-Finci requirement from the EU Stabilization and Association Agreement to come into force. Right, so a couple of things about compact. I'm not going to dwell too much on it. At first it was said that a broad spectrum of civil, academic, business, and political members of society attended this forum, right? So this was the pitch by the international community. And that they together came up with this package of 6 austerity measures. And then when a B&A journalist, Nedžad Ahmetašević, interviewed Dutch ambassador Jurjen Krak about, well, she said she was part of the protest. She was she's an activist, and she actually participated in the protest. She's a journalist as well. When she asked him about the people who were invited to these consultations, right, to come up with this sudden document, he said, no, you know, there were people from Bosnia who also participated. And she's like, I tried to find them and I couldn't find any. You know, it was another, he said, I completely disagree. I was in Ilidža at the presentations, etc., etc. These were long sessions. But this wasn't really true. Again, it was one of those opaque, behind the closed door processes, and they just issue a new document. They say, voila, here, you know, you guys do this, and only then will you move forward. But another thing also is important here, and I don't want to go into the whole conspiracy theory, but I think it's worth mentioning that the European Foreign Policy Scorecards, just like this website giving estimates on how democratic each of these countries are, this EU Foreign Policy Scorecard covering events of 2014 and reflecting onto these effects gave Bosnia a grade C. Unambiguously stating the following. You can find that on their website. They stated that Europe had to tailor its policies to the challenges at play. And what were the challenges at play? Well, one such challenge, the scorecard suggested, was a Moscow support for Republika Srpska's Milorad Dodik, who toyed with a Crimea-style independence declaration. Another challenge was the threat of ISIS terrorism, which became especially significant after a gunman shouting Allahu Akbar killed a police officer in Zvornik police station, and wounded 2 others on 27th of April 2015. Note that neither one of these events had anything to do with economic issues or issues of social justice. These were clearly geopolitical concerns that played a role. I think the EU just needed to do something. They used the protest, they kind of, you know, were attuned to what people had to say. In reality, they really weren't. There was this concrete geopolitical threat, you know, on both sides, the Federation and the RS. And basically, this was a shift away from Sejdić-Finci to another. They basically needed another thing, you know, to play with. And as a result, the Council of Europe unfroze the Stabilization and Association Agreement after 7 years in 2015, stating all of a sudden that Bosnia had fulfilled the necessary requirements to start its accession process. All of a sudden, sve u redu, nema problema, idemo dalje. Okay, so all this context I've used to paint the picture of what really, you know, preceded the compact. And the compact itself, I mean, you can look at it, and this is how it was marketed. They basically hired, I think, a Western PR company to do this in Bosnia. These are the 6 measures proposed by the compact. I mean, it's just a set of 6 austerities, kind of dense. I mean, you don't have to read it if you don't want to. But basically, it's a set of measures that all of a sudden will bring peace and prosperity. And what I look at is not really the compact itself. I mean, the compact is easy, but I look at 2 types of responses that emerge to the compact. Our politicians, they're like, cool, you know, we need to take this because this is something that was thrown off the European table. We don't do it. You know, we'll do economic or the reform agenda. We don't care. But then 2 sets of responses emerge related to compact. I think those 2 sets of responses, I call them a liberal response or a liberal critique of the compact that emerged from the Western think tanks, and then a leftist domestic response that's embodied in the so-called paper published anonymously by the Movement of Social Justice Sarajevo, which was called The Compact with the Devil. And then the liberal response, I look into two DPC papers. DPC is the Democratic Policy Council. These papers were written by people such as Valerie Perry, Kurt Bassuner, I don't know if you know them, Oscar Fernandez, a couple of others. They're clearly, you know, I think some of them live in Sarajevo or have lived in Sarajevo. They're part of this big NGO, international NGO scene, think tanks. These are all analysts, consultants, etc., etc. These names are common to those who follow like what's going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So in terms of the two policy papers, let me just read them to you. Basically, they were published, one in November 2014, one in the spring of 2015. Yeah, I'll let you know about these papers later. And this is the concise agenda for reform. So based on these 6 measures of what Bosnia should do in order to be fast-tracked on the EU path, this is how it's going to be implemented. So taxes on jobs, barriers to jobs, business climate, enterprises, corruption, social protection. Only social protection, but it's not clear. So I look into these sort of 2 sets of critiques of the compact to point out. I think it's kind of reading against. It's like a juxtaposed reading. So I'm reading against this text. I'm not reading into the text. I'm not offering a close reading of the compact because there isn't much there. But I look at the 2 sets of responses that emerged upon the compact had been launched. So basically defining so the first set of responses is this liberal critique that's based on these think tanks and the sort of Democratization Policy Council. This is the opinion that's shared by many, again, I don't know, sort of, I know some of you sort of from which kind of background you come from, but I mean, at many conferences you'll see people, many international professors even, you know, British, German, doesn't matter, who are specialists on Bosnia, who will be adherents of this sort of liberal Bosnia needs to do this. And the problem with this stance, this is something that perhaps may have, I mean, you know, even in 1997, nobody in Bosnia, for instance, nobody's aware, like very few people are aware that, that we've been robbed, literally. So the discourse was, oh, you know, let's just democratize, Europeanize, and the money will come in. Well, it won't, you know. We remain stuck in this position of European semi-periphery, and this is how things are. But many, I've noticed that many foreign international professors who are experts on the Balkans still adhere to this view, who are not critical, who think problems are nationalism, corruption, bad government, how only if we had rule of law the situation would be blissful and wonderful. This is really problematic, and we will see why this is problematic. This is the reform agenda. Please just note these women here. This is what the Compact for Growth. These are the jobs that will happen in Bosnia when we fulfill the compact. Yeah, so we're all to become, you know, textile industry or seamstresses or something like that. These women all have makeup. They seem rather happy, but it's really paradoxical if this is the future. You know, this basically tells us, well, you can be a seamstress, but you cannot be a professor. You cannot be whatever. You know, these are the jobs for you guys, and then we'll do something else. Then you'll export that to Great Britain, or you'll export that to some other countries. So the basic claim for the liberals is that in the new compact, they dismissed it pretty much. They said that the basic claim was for them that there were no proverbial sticks and carrots. I mean, if you analyze the OHR discourse for the past 10 years, there's a lot of talk about sticks and carrots. You know, if you do this, if you take this stick, you know, or, you know, if you don't do this, we'll punish you. If you take this, then you're going to get this carrot. There are no proverbial sticks and carrots in case the new reforms are not implemented, and that the compact ignores the previous EU documents, EU conditions too lightly. One thing that the compact ignored was the Sejdić-Finci ruling. Note that the criticism that they position here is not concerned with workers or the potential economic consequences of the compact. Instead, it argues for a robust and deeper intervention in B&H political affairs through stricter EU involvement and greater strengthening of B&H state institutions, while defining a clear set of regulations for governing the B&H. Here are the two documents, if you're interested. Report, one is called Report for Progress in B&H, and another is Making the Market on Constitutional Reform in the B&H in the Wake of the EU Initiative. So these documents I take as my, textual evidence for this so-called liberal critique of the compact. The political rhetoric visible in the two DPC papers abound in directives, like this is what you should do this, you should do that, so it's not about social justice, it's not about even economic restructuring, and moreover one between foreigners, and about how to restructure the relations between foreign powers and B&H political authorities and administration. They basically say the following. This is like a set of 7 imperatives that they've laid out in the first report for progress in B&H. So this is what Bosnia should do. For instance, refrain from lowering the bar on conditionality by removing the Sejdić-Finci condition from entering the SAA. They don't think it's great that they got rid of Sejdić-Finci. Set the initial reform agenda, take this, So it's basically, look at the number 7. Establish a privatization review panel to meet citizen demands from 7th February protests. This is the only way, this is the only instance in which they address the protest. So the liberal critique of the compact has nothing to do with the actual, protests or plenums, except in this part. They want to establish this independent privatization, and here is more. Re-establish red lines, jointly articulated not just by Berlin and London, but also EU. They basically call for a greater involvement. They basically, this discourse harkens back to the first stage, the OHR stage. Get a stronger EU and US presence in Bosnia. This is one of their demands. Develop a real compact with B&H citizens. Not clear what this real compact is. Establish independent privatization agency. I mean, how do you read that? It's like more bureaucracy. And by the way, independent has come to mean not Bosnia and Herzegovina. Independent means another international NGO. Take this number 4. I think this is what's happening right now. Marry international funding, international financial instrument funding to the reform agenda. This is exactly what we're having right now in Bosnia. It's a question whether in June a new agreement will be signed with the IMF, which means that people who are in the public sector might not get paid. Our salaries were 2 months and 5 days later this month. So this all, I mean, I wrote this paper a year and a half ago, maybe a year ago, and then you can already see that some of these really have come into force. Adopt a strategic approach with B&H neighbors. Demand Serbia's leaders publicly state they do not support our secession. Ensure the appointment of political for the vacant post of EUSR. So one note here, EUSR, European Special Representative, during 4 years was also the OHR. And in other words, the OHR was double-headed at the time. That is now vacant, that position is vacant, and now this is something that I know informally. There's a great discrepancy between what the OHR and the EU think should be done in Bosnia. So basically this is what they wanted. They hated the compact, they wanted these measures, and they want to reassert the international influence and they basically conceive of power as still to belong to political elites. And they don't know how to get rid of parliamentary democracy, and they're like, well, this is what you should do. You should adopt a stricter approach. They're not interested in workers, they're not interested in redistribution. They want these politicians to remain in power, but they kind of expect a nicer political elite to just emerge in Bosnia. Which is not what's going to happen. They focus on elites. They basically, for these guys, it's vague how a post-Dayton order will be determined. I mean, they kind of want it, but they don't know how it's going to be done. Only they don't know how to go about it, but they know that it must be shaped by an assertive yet unknown self-defined group of citizens, which is completely crazy. This suggests that the more important requirement for constitutional reform is an assertive outside force to discipline recalcitrant elites. What this focus on elites and valorization of presumably non-elite citizens overlooks is that doing away with the Dayton Order is hard, not just because of the lack of political will to give up these key instruments of power, but it's difficult because of the extensive network of people that the Dayton Order sustains. Steph Jansen and Larissa Kurtovic write about this Dayton meantime. They're anthropologists. They write about this the Dayton meantime, what happens when you don't necessarily want to be a part of HDZ or SDA or SNSD, but you join because you have to support your family. So the Dayton Order, however schizophrenic in many ways supports an entire network of people. So this, this political clientelism is a mechanism of survival. You cannot just do away with it, So it's not just, oh, Dayton's bad, we got to do something about it, but Dayton sustains this whole network of people, and in circumstances of economic poverty, where most strategic enterprises have already been privatized or dead, and most money is in the hands of relatively few individuals, everyday party clientelism, especially in the most dominant ethno-nationalist parties, is very agentive, and we should read it as agentive. It's not just a passive surrendering of, it's a pragmatic choice, if you wish. It's a survival principle. It doesn't matter whether the people subscribe to these ideologies or not. They do it because they got to live off of something. So basically, they're advocating for a more assertive role by the European Union, arguing that it is, in essence, in a relation of responsibility for the political processes in BNH. This report criticizes Bosnia as a so-called weak state. They critique the EU's complicity with BNH ethno-nationalist elites and weakness of the international community after 20 years long engagement with Bosnia, which has resulted in fragmented, disrupted, divisive, and discriminatory, if you wish, constitutional structure. One blind spot or contradiction here is that is common to such policy criticism is that the effects that this has on the ability of ordinary citizens to exercise any degree of political agency outside the relations of party patronage. And the citizens did exercise quite a bit of agency, I would say, in February 2014. And of course, it's highly dubious. What this critique suggests that reforming the OHR into this last enforcer of Dayton, like the final authority in theater, which is what it says on their website, is conducive to support efforts to develop bottom-up alternatives that can garner support throughout BNH. Like the first report, which wants to see the EU engaged in the more social dialogue with BNH citizens and forge direct alliances for meaningful reform rather than planning to engage a Western PR agency to do all this. So, there is a problem here. They are critiquing, and there are some, obviously correct things in there. They're critiquing the weak state, but they don't know how to make this state stronger because the state as such, the post-Dayton stage, is problematic on so many levels, right? So they kind of want this new elite to emerge. They want OHR to be stronger. They want a bigger involvement of the EU and the USA, but they don't provide any real guidelines as to how to do it. So what would be the step to do it? Well, if you remember, in 1997, 1988, there was a huge amount of money given to independent media, to different organizations, promotion of culture, this and that. And that really didn't do much in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It still remains divided. There's little communication between Sarajevo, Banja Luka, Mostar. So it's just, and I don't think they're going to do it, to be honest. In addition, I don't know if I mentioned this is very important, Bosnia boasts one of the largest unemployed youth populations in Europe, which is 62.7%. So that That is quite impressive, you know. So following this is of people, you know, between 15 and 2014, you know, 24, sorry, people who were born after Dayton. So these people are jobless, and they're probably going to remain jobless for the time being. Their only reality is the one of post-Dayton poverty and lack of opportunities. And a new twist in politics, or even a new class of politicians, will not just suddenly emerge, financed by the international community, to engage in this redistribution process. Nor can we expect the existing class to surrender without a fight. So this is really a situation where, you know, new revolution, new war, you know, you don't know. It's very, very dangerous. The current liberal international critique of post-Dayton B&H does not have much to say about how to create relations of accountability between citizens and government, about how to encourage Bosnia's political classes to respond to the emerging bottom-up grassroots perspectives generated by the protests and plenums, which is beginning to reverse the ethnopolitics precisely by pressing for socially inclusive reforms and greater social justice. Let me now just mention this left critique so you can see what this critique is about, and I'm going to finish there. So, you know, the left criticism, or what we have learned from Tuzla, I take Tuzla to be a synecdoche type of a metaphor for, you know, before we had Dayton and Brussels, and then we had Tuzla, and obviously Tuzla offered new avenues of looking at what's happening to the entire country. While the foreign criticism basically bashed the initiative, the British-German initiative, and the compact for sidelining unresolved political matters rooted in the Dayton Constitution, and the EU for not drawing these red lines, a different domestic critique took a detour away from the Dayton altogether. They didn't really discuss Dayton at all. They focused on detrimental socioeconomic effects that the austerity measures proposed by the compact could have on the entire population, especially its most vulnerable members. Interestingly, the arguments of both the international liberal and domestic leftist critique overlap in several respects, such as the vagueness of suggested measures. They all agree that these measures are pretty vague, and they critique the weak state, but from different angles. The left critique obviously has a different vision in defining the role of the state, but leaves undiscussed how, given the fragmented and dysfunctional collection of governments created by the Dayton Agreement, one might create a strong state that could realize its demands for greater social investments and a fairer distribution. So the movement, I'm going to call it the MSJ, so it's the Movement for Social Justice Sarajevo, which is an informal group of activists, intellectuals who were involved around these plenums and protests. The movement's document argues that the compact itself discounts the need for a strong state that is more than just a regulator. It noted that its reforms would not by themselves attract investors who would then employ people en masse, because why? Bosnian workers are still paid a lot more than workers in Asia and Africa, you know, sweatshops. It further observed that investment takes time, particularly the kind that would put a serious dent in unemployment, because industry was no longer a very profitable sector. Moreover, the general global financial situation was seen as discouraging investment, thus making such investment an unlikely candidate to jumpstart economic recovery. Instead, it is only likely that state-driven social investment could perform that role. This document's criticism thus brings socialist discourse back into the picture, while also redefines the meaning of being European. In other words, it contextualizes its response to the compact in the tectonic changes, to quote Kovras and Loizdes, that are shaping future European politics, kind of in line with what's happening in Greece. Basically, it's a call. What they're saying, it's a call for redistribution, Keynesian-style control over jobs, employment, to secure more egalitarianism. This is what they, you know, this was their response to the compact. But they also insist on advocating nationalizations of key industries. And you know, this nationalization of key industries imposed in Dayton, Bosnia and Herzegovina. My question is, how to do it, because it's divided. I mean, these industries, you know, former Souri, Ori, Šipad, for instance, you know, or this is something, this nationalization kind of worked when privatization was happening, because I don't know if you know, Mittal privatized both Zenica, Željezara Zenica, and Rudnic Prijedor. So you know, Mittal doesn't know the boundaries, right, when it privatizes, but we are having a big problem with nationalizations of key industries because we have literally two countries in one. Just several things. I'm not going to, I think we're running out of time. Several things. For instance, one thing that Compact suggests is to cut down labor costs from 40% to 35%, you know, which is the European standard. Well, how do they want to do it? By increasing, they want to reduce current government expenditures, broadening the tax base to include more sources of revenue. But they provide no reference to what these potentially taxable areas are, or whether and to what extent this measure would be a further burden on low-income workers. Let me quote this. For example, the parallel decrease of income tax and increase of VAT, PDV, could reduce the tax burden on labor, but would simultaneously mean consumers, including pensioners and low-income workers, paying more for various products, even staple good. Although such šta se dešava. Okay, so I'm going to finish this in English and we'll talk in our language. So what's happening here? They want to broaden the tax base, but they don't want to introduce, for instance, luxury tax. There are potential ways of making these arrangements, but they basically just want to make it better with the new labor law. They want to make it better for the employers, so employers have to pay less. This is what cutting, burden on labor means, but that means that we'll have to pay more money for various products as vulnerable members like pensioners, etc., etc. So they say instead an actually constructive way to ensure new revenues and at the same time protect workers and the rest of the population of the country would be to introduce a differentiated tax on income, abolish taxation of the minimum wage, differentiating VAT rates for basic products relative to other goods, and introducing a luxury tax that would be directed towards health and pension funds, monitoring of the process, etc., etc. What else? Also, the compact is pitched in such a way that only if we follow these austerity measures, foreign investments will just jump in. Well, it's not what's happening in reality. What the EU disregards here, this is something that MSJ observes, is the fact that foreign investor logic always aims to maximize gains in the shortest time and with the lowest risk. So nobody's going to be really risking their money in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the compact basically signifies the push, as you probably have gathered by now, signifies a further push of neoliberal policies in B&H without taking into account the complex social and economic context or the wider implications of these measures, because you already have an impoverished population. You already have a population that's so vulnerable that it cannot go on much further. One other measure the MSJ proposes is a redistribution plan on mass post-flood employment. So that's something that would be like this silver lining of the tragedy of the heavy floods. I've just finished my collection of data on the floods in Serbia and Croatia, and these people feel pretty much forgotten. They feel the floods were even worse than the war, and that happened in, well, Maglaj, Doboj, and Shamac. These three towns were hit the most by the floods. Here, Obrenovac, etc. The question with the left critique is, again, how this would look in Dayton-based practice, since organizing mass post-flood recovery through more job opportunities and even the taxation of the richest or the nationalization of key industries would all run along Dayton-established entity lines. What would, indeed, I mean, how could we imagine politically this nationalization in a Dayton-based state system, if this is the only way to do it, right? The floods of the 2014 and the response to them revealed that the true challenge might be coming up with a plan for economic and social recovery that goes both beyond Dayton and the compact. Because as they say, the river Bosnia did not run along the entity line. It really, brought people together because they all experienced the flood. So how would to end this finally, What is going on here? I also believe this institute and some of you people have tried to sort of take this matter. This is not something new to you. This is a matter of how is Europe going to be redefined in the light of what's happening with Podemos, Syriza, Bosnia, Serbia, all these countries with the refugee crisis, immigration, however you want to call it. What is basically, I've started with Europeanization. I think I'm going to end with Europe. I think this is a formidable challenge, and to ask about the position of us and them, like, are we Europe, are we not part of Europe? Is Europe experiencing something that's going to redefine, to find a new signifier for Europe? I think the old signifiers are pretty much spent. This is the problem that discloses the issues of illiberal parliamentary democracy, especially in a war-torn, corrupt, and impoverished economy such as Bosnia, which gives us these lenses. So in Bosnian example, we can see, for instance, the labor law. We had huge protests in Paris. We had huge protests in Banja Luka in December regarding labor. So I think the labor law can be a potentially unifying, document and practice that could bring people together all over the place. And what, if any, kind of social change is possible in a society that operates under this Dayton logic, that is apartheid logic, that is problematic, that excludes whoever is not the dominant white male Bosniak, Serb, or Croat from any decision making. Given the complex socialist legacies that and the new class interests, there is a lack of a unifying narrative, and this is not just me, this is many people are saying this right now, not just in Bosnia, but in the whole of Europe, and a different narrative, I guess, is needed. A new politics in Bosnia and Herzegovina is also required, one that will be attuned to the commons, the things that belong to all of us and none of us, from factories and enterprises to monuments and museums. And this must also be a politics of equality, égalité, for all the losers of the post-Dayton transition in a time when the shortage of resources is becoming even more apparent. Solidarity is definitely a new word, a word that we need more and more. And perhaps somewhere between failed nationalist fantasies that have only left us empty-bellied on the European semi-periphery, can we realize our post-Dayton predicament as a starting point and look at the plenums of protest as a spark of hope for some future solidarity that awaits us. Thank you very much. Sad možemo preći na naš jezik.